Hey there, it's Jason Gorman from Codemanship with another video diary update. It's Sunday the 19th of April. I have to check what day it is these days. The 19th of April. We're still in lockdown and there's no sign of an end to that just yet. But life is okay. I've been for a walk. The sun is shining. I've done my shopping for today, which always stresses me out a little bit. I do wish more people knew what 2 meters looked like. But other than that, life is okay. I have recently been doing quite a lot of programming in COBOL for the first time in 25 years. And that's the story I wanted to tell you this evening. I put out a fairly bit of a hot take as a tweet, but I think most people were kind of agreeing, sort of, about the essence of agility. Not agile with a capital A. I don't talk about agile anymore. But the essence of agility, of being responsive to change in software development. And to illustrate that, I wanted to talk about my COBOL experience. So when I first started working as a programmer after leaving university, I'd moved back to my hometown of Worcester, and there weren't many opportunities for software developers in the vicinity of Worcester. To be honest, that's probably still true. And therefore, to get programming jobs, I was either having to travel, I was contracting at the time, or I had to sort of go and find companies in the area in Worcester. One of whom was quite a big COBOL shop. They'd been using mainframe computers since the late 1950s. They used to write their own programming languages and their own tools. They were quite advanced 40 years before I arrived. But by the time I got there, it was mostly legacy COBOL. Now, here's my experience of working in COBOL at the time in the mid-90s. So we worked on terminals. We didn't have our own PCs or anything like that. So it was all time sharing. And we didn't have electronic version control. We had a kind of version control. If you changed a module or a program, what you had to do was you had to submit that to be printed to the printers in Manchester, and your new code listing would show up delivered by van the next morning. You would then go to a big row of cupboards. You would find the listing for the program you changed, take the old one out and put the new listing in. And that was our version of version control. And I'd never actually seen any kind of version control before. Except for just backing up files, which is what I used to do. And so I thought, I didn't think that much of it, but looking back on it now, it seems horrendous. So the first thing that was a real problem there is we didn't have any real version control. There was no easy way back to the way the code was before, because I was thinking back on it now. If I made a boo-boo and totally screwed it up, what do? Do I go back to the cupboard, get the code listing and type it back in? The answer, of course, is yes, because the only other way to revert the code would be to revert the whole system. And that was millions of lines of code for hundreds of businesses that were part of this group. The other thing that now gives me the screaming heebie-jeebies, but again, I didn't really think of it at the time, was we didn't just do no automated testing, we did virtually no testing at all. The way that we tested things mostly was we would go live and then we would wait for our beepers to go off at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that's how we knew we'd broken it, which invariably we had. So no real testing, certainly no automated testing, and no real version control, no easy way back to something that worked before, except rolling everybody's work back. So looking back, a bit of a nightmare, very, very backward practices. Now, my next experience after that, after I left, I decided not to renew and moved on, funnily enough, was that for an American company, writing real software with real software engineers. And this was a first for me. Never had that kind of experience before. And I was introduced to two things. I was introduced to a lot of things. I was introduced to UML and use cases and the unified process and processes like Fusion and then Syntropy and things like that. So I was introduced to a whole bunch of stuff to do with software engineering and the theory and the practice of it. But there were two things that, to me, looking back, probably made the biggest difference. One was real version control. We were using Perforce, and that was a revelation to me. It was like suddenly having seatbelts after years of driving around with no seatbelts, with no precautions at all. And the other thing that I think made a huge difference was fast running automated unit tests. I'd never done it before. I'd never really heard of it before. I was totally naive, totally green. And looking back, I think that's probably what made the biggest difference. And in the 25 years since, I still think it's the one thing I do now that I didn't do then that has made the biggest difference. Being able to know if I've broken the code as soon as I've changed it is absolutely profound. Since that experience, I have not shipped any broken code. It just doesn't happen. The occasional bug, but on the whole, the software I ship works, and I change it and it still works, and I change it and it still works. And that's had an effect on everything around the way that I work and the teams that I work on. Because the feedback cycle of testing, how long that takes and how effective that is, has a real impact on all the other feedback cycles in software development. You see teams that have slow testing cycles, maybe days or even weeks, and that means necessarily they have slow delivery cycles, very slow delivery cycles. So they're getting feedback from end users and from their customers very, very infrequently. Teams that can test their software like that can get feedback as often as they need to. So they tend to learn a lot more. Basically, they're able to iterate their designs much faster. So they converge on a working solution, on a good solution, much faster than teams who spend a long time testing, whether it's slow running system tests or even manual tests. So it makes a big, big difference. And as far as I can tell, from my experience coaching and consulting teams and working with a whole range of clients, hundreds of them now, it so often has boiled down to that feedback loop, the delivery cycle. How fast can we get to the next delivery? That I am now pretty convinced that the key practice in agility in software development, not agile with a capital A, that's some other thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the key essence of agility in software development is the ability to retest your software very, very quickly and very, very cheaply. So I appreciate it's a hot take. There are armies of agile coaches out there who can't help teams with that, either because they've never been programmers and they're not technical, so they can't help with those technical practices, or it's been so long since they've programmed, they kind of know in principle we should do this, but they're not up to date, so they can't demonstrate unless they have to demonstrate in COBOL or C or Visual Basic 6 or whatever it was they were using the last time they programmed. So 90%, I've reviewed a lot of CVs for agile coaches, and I've done my own little sort of surveys using LinkedIn. And what I've discovered is 70% of agile coaches have never written code. And a further 20%, it's been so long since they've written code that they probably can't help you either. So that means that only 10% of agile coaches, agile with a capital A, actually have current technical skills that they can use to help teams with what I genuinely believe, from experience and from looking at so many teams, is essential. It's fundamental to achieving agility. So it's an odd kind of state of affairs. So what are all these other agile coaches doing to help their teams? And this is the interesting thing to me, because I think if you can't get the technical side of it at least half right, if you can't improve on things like fast running unit tests and build automation and refactoring and all of that side of things that make change easy and cheap, then everything else gets much, much harder. It's all very well having a great relationship with your customer and being able to, communicate with them every day or whenever you want. But to use an analogy, imagine you're a taxi driver and you've trapped the customer in the back seat of your car So you've got a captive customer, but your engine isn't working. So your customer's going to have to sit there while you fiddle with the engine, trying to get the car started. That's kind of what it feels like to me. It's all about direction and et cetera, and particularly about getting feedback. But the feedback you're getting, if you adopt Scrum or Kanban or something like that, is very probably going to be telling you that you're not really going anywhere. You're not achieving any kind of agility. You're not being able to respond to changes to requirements. So I guess my message is, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't get help with these things, with things like requirements and backlogs and all, although I'm not a big fan of backlogs. That we'll talk about that some other day. I'm not saying that those things don't matter. What I'm saying is if change is very, very hard, they won't make any difference. All they'll do is highlight the fact, they'll make it painfully visible that you have a problem on the technical side. And you have to address that problem. So you need to, don't just go out and look for help with Scrum or with Kanban or Lean or any of that stuff. Or SAFe, God help us. Because none of that will make any difference at all if your delivery cycles are very slow and very expensive, if changing your software is too expensive. And from all the evidence we have, the biggest factor in that is how long it takes you to retest it. How soon will you know if you've broken it? So I guess that's Sunday's message. You've got to get those basics right. And then you can start basically worry about the engine and the wheels and all the fundamentals and the brakes, and then start thinking about looking at the map and deciding where you want to go in your car. All very well having a plan, but if you can't execute the plan, then it's just a plan. It's not going to happen. And I've seen that happen so many times. I've seen it happen on some massive scales. I've seen companies, billion-dollar companies, brought crashing to the ground. And when you investigated, when you got to the root cause of it all, it was their inability to change the software quickly and cheaply. So, something to think about. I hope you are keeping safe. Stay indoors unless you have to go out. And I'll speak to you at the next update.